Welcome to episode 218 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/218. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel, and today it's another guest interview, and my guest is Anna Sweeney. So Anna is a certified eating disorder registered dietitian who provides nutrition care using a non-diet, intuitive eating and health at every size paradigm. Anna is an expert in providing care for individuals struggling with eating disorders, disordered eating and body image concerns. And over the last decade, she's served in a supervisory role at multiple eating disorder treatment centers, including the position of National Director of Nutrition Services for Monte Nido. Anna is also the owner of Whole Life Nutrition Counseling in Concord, Massachusetts, where she works exclusively with clients with eating disorders, disordered eating, or an interest in intuitive eating. Anna is passionate about nutrition, balance, and wellness, and works to empower her clients to trust their own body wisdom. So I've been aware of Anna's work for the last couple of years, having heard her on various podcasts. And more recently, I've been seeing what she's been doing on Instagram and just seeing how great she is at doing Instagram. And so I was excited to get her to come on the show. And as part of this episode, we chat about Anna's background. And a lot of this revolves around her diagnosis with MS at age 15 and how that is then progressed. So we talk about what MS is and how this has affected Anna's life over the last couple of decades, leading to the point that she's at now where she is a disabled person. We talk about the idea of body acceptance and what this has meant for Anna as she continues to constantly have the rug pulled from under her as her body continues to change. And we chat about Anna coming out about her disability because she wasn't always talking about it, and now it's really a focal part of her message. We cover how she got into working as a dietitian and her desire to specialize in eating disorder recovery. And we also cover the wonderful work she's doing on Instagram and the sense of responsibility that she feels about this. I really enjoyed this conversation and I hope you do too. I'll be back at the end with a couple of recommendations of things I've watched recently, but for now, here is my conversation with Anna Sweeney. Hey Anna, thanks for joining me on the show today.
I'm so delighted to be with you, Chris.
Yeah, so you are doing such an amazing job on Instagram, and I've been through so much of it this morning in preparation for this call, and there really is a lot that I want to go through with you about you and your story and all the work that you're doing. So yeah, I'm really excited for this. And as a starting point, do you want to give listeners a bit of background on yourself, like who you are, what you do, what training you've done, that kind of thing, just as a starting place?
Sure, I'd be delighted. So my name's Anna. Hi, everyone. I am an eating disorder registered dietitian, and I have had the good fortune of working at all levels of eating disorder care. I now and am exclusively in outpatient private practice. And as you were saying, I spend some amount of time on Instagram and have been really fortunate to create a community there. I feel like my calling on this planet has been to be an eating disorder dietitian. I feel very fortunate to have fallen into that place or into that role. And now I'm able to take all of the experiences that I've had and bring my message to the relative masses, which is nothing in comparison to the diet industry. But I am but one voice, but I'm not going anywhere. I am a certified intuitive eating counselor. I practice from a health at every size, social justice oriented paradigm. And I also happen to be a full-time disabled person.
Okay. So yeah, let's start with the full-time disabled person piece. So you were diagnosed with MS in your teens?
I was 15 years old. And in retrospect, I was 12 when I had my first flare. So I'm very, very, very adept at having MS.
Yeah. And so what led, so you said from age 12, really. So what led up to this? What symptoms were you getting that made you think I need to get something investigated?
So I grew up in South Dakota, and my father told me, my dad is from the Boston area. His father was diagnosed with cancer, and my dad told me that we were moving to Massachusetts. I was 12 years old, and life moves at a different rate in South Dakota, a little bit faster. And I was told that we were moving, but I couldn't tell anyone for 30 days because of something regarding his job. And the stress from that resulted in my developing this very bizarre tingling numbness feeling on my abdomen. It wasn't interfering with any part of my life. It was just like, this is really weird. I wonder what this is.
Kind of like a shingles, but on the front?
So not painful,
Okay.
at all. And it certainly didn't look like anything. It's just there was this tingling numbness on predominantly the front right side of my trunk. It ultimately kind of went around the entirety of my trunk girdle from front to back. And as I moved through the acute stressor of kind of reconciling the fact that I was moving, the symptoms resolved and things went away, and we just kind of moved on. And when I was 15, I was playing basketball at my friend John's house. And I will say this very, without any challenge, I am not a particularly athletic person. And I kind of fake dunked a basketball on a very lowered hoop. And I've done, actually, this is another South Dakota story. I was pushed off tractor tires that were on the playground this is the things that we play on. There were tractor tires, and I was playing tag, and one of my friends pushed me off. I dislocated both of my shoulders out the back when I was in third grade. And so I have weak shoulders. I thought that I had done something weird to my shoulder when I was dunking the basketball because I lost some feeling and control in my right hand. My mother's father was a GP, and he said, Nancy, take your daughter to a neurologist. Just make sure she hasn't done nerve damage to her shoulder. Fast forward, I go to an outpatient children's hospital clinic, and I couldn't feel pitchfork vibration on my left big toe. I was then pointed in the direction of an MRI, which fortunately the technology has come a long way in 20 years. But in the midst of the MRI that was taking forever, I asked the rad tech, what was taking so long? And he said something to me along the lines of, we're trying to rule out MS. I lost my mind because it was the first I had heard of this.
Did you know what MS was at that stage?
So I did, because one of my mom's very good friends in South Dakota, and she's still there, has MS. And the way that Camian's multiple sclerosis presents to her, what my mom told me stories about was like, it feels like having a pine cone in your bladder. That has not been my experience, but that was the only frame of reference that I had for MS. So I knew a little bit, but I actually knew nothing. But I knew that I hadn't hurt my shoulder. I knew this was a bigger deal than something orthopedic. And I was clever enough to know that this was now a really big deal. So by the time I left the MRI and got back to my house, which is probably about a 10-minute drive, my legs felt like they were on fire. Wow. So I had weakness in my right hand and this burning sensation in my legs. We went to Children's Hospital Boston, my mom and my dad and me went to the hospital in the morning. I spent the morning in the emergency room at Children's, got a spinal tap, and then was taken up to the 9th floor, had 5 days of steroids, and felt totally like myself at the end. And then was taken into a library on that floor and told that I had these really beautiful bright spots in my brain. And then the diagnosis was official.
Wow. So we're going to be mentioning MS a bit, I would imagine, through this conversation. So for people who don't know what that is, can you just explain it so that everyone's on the same page?
Sure. So multiple sclerosis is a disease of the central nervous system where myelin, the protective sheath that covers nerve cells, is identified by the body. Like my body is attacking the myelin sheath. So when I try to describe this to folks, I think about like you plug in whatever's charging your computer right now, and the plastic wiring that's covering the wires. Picture that as the myelin. And if you took away the plastic coating that covers the wires that go from your computer to the plug in the wall, you would be able to see the wires visibly, and plausibly the conduction would not be as clear. That's what's happening to my brain and anyone who has multiple sclerosis. The nerves are not protected. So that means that nerve conduction is not complete and messages get, missed.
Yeah. And are there different types?
So there are different types of MS. I was originally diagnosed with relapsing remitting multiple sclerosis, and this is the way that most people are diagnosed. And usually, so relapsing remitting MS means you have a flare and then you're treated with most commonly Solumedrol, like a really heavy hitting intravenous steroid, and you go back to normal. Your body you don't lose function. You take this one finite flare experience and then you close the door and keep moving on. For most folks, and for many people, that's their experience with MS. They have one acute experience and then they're either held stably in that space or they have persistent flares. I flared 13 times. I was treated with IV steroids 13 times in the context of my high school experience.
Wow.
And then we move on to what is called secondary progressive MS. So when someone is diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, they're either diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS. So you have this flare, you're treated with steroids, everything goes back to normal, or primary progressive MS, where you have a flare, you might be treated, it doesn't do anything, the treatment doesn't work, and you just get worse and worse and worse. More commonly than not, people start with relapsing remitting and then advance to what is called secondary progressive MS, where now my MRIs, with and without contrast to show active flares, I no longer have flare activity and I'm acquiring disability regardless of what I do.
Yeah. And I'm just, in terms of me thinking about MS, the one that I always think of is like the West Wing. That is kind of like my point of reference for MS, because I think that was where I first heard of it and was most, or I'd heard of it before, but that was kind of the most sort of visual way I'd seen it sort of demonstrated or thought about it at any great length. Yep.
I actually met Bradley Whitford at an MS organization in Boston. My family has been associated with fundraising in this space, and Bradley's wife actually has MS.
Okay, wow, I did not know that. And so you said when it was originally sort of diagnosed, it really hit you, and you had a family friend who or a friend of your mother's who had it, and so you had some concept of what it was. Like, how was it then, like, comprehending all this? Because I think as a kid, there's somewhat this feeling of being invincible, and you don't really ponder death or aging or disease. And so did that sort of childlike naivety just completely disappear?
No. And I will say, I have, forever and ever and ever, everyone has always said, you're so old for your age. Like there are a million reasons why I have been precocious since I was a little person. But I was diagnosed with MS when I was 15. I didn't actually do any real research about the disease until the year after I was actually diagnosed. But to be frank with you, I think the most traumatic experience I had in high school was learning how to give myself shots. That experience was really unpleasant, but now I would be awesome at it if that were an option for me. But I behaved like a high school kid. I drank and I misbehaved, and I lived like I was a young person, and I didn't really, I knew I had this big disease, but it's really impossible to be 15 and then conceptualize myself a decade, 2 decades down the line and think oh shoot, this is for real.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, what kind of a child were you in high school? What group were you hanging out with? What was your identity like in high school?
I am I did very well in school. I really like school and learning, but I was a popular kid, and as I said, I didn't have an athletic identity, but I had a very large social group, and my dearest friend and she had some, high school trauma things happen, and we kind of came together as these two people with big picture crises. And I drank a lot when I was in high school, and did all of the normal high school rebellious things. Never got in trouble. I was a good kid doing, I think, normal adolescent things. Yeah. And then, yeah.
Okay. And how were your friends about it in high school? And how did you deal with it with your friends? Was there a tendency, and I don't know how much you were showing symptoms at that stage, but I think sometimes there's that tendency to make fun of yourself or self-deprecate. And so was that going on?
So to be really honest, Chris, I will never forget when I was originally diagnosed, when I was in the hospital for those 5 days. I received countless cards. One of my friends had made this very large, get well soon card, which is kind of a funny joke to give to someone with a chronic illness, but a get well soon card. And it was signed by, all of the really attractive senior boys and these people that I thought didn't know who I was, but I got a lot of accolade, and I was really held very gently when I was first diagnosed. And the challenge that I faced as high school continued was the fact that every time I had a subsequent flare, I was taken back to step one, the acute fear response happened for me. But my friends didn't arrive in the same way in subsequent flare experiences. And this is one place that I really have a lot of empathy for my clients with eating disorders, where they are acutely met with extraordinary concern at the beginning of their stories. And then it just becomes kind of part of an identity. And it's oh, well, Anna has an IV in her arm. That's sad. But we now just know Anna has MS.
Yeah. And so it kind of just normalizes the experience, but not necessarily in a good way.
I mean, I think it's just, I became the diagnosis became old hat for everyone except for me.
And when did it stop becoming old hat, or is it not ever going to stop becoming old hat?
I think that I didn't actually start to develop any persistent disability. And I'm very fortunate. I have to say, I have met a number of people in the course of my life with MS. And multiple sclerosis shows up for folks differently. I have met a number of people who are in physically normal bodies who have lost significant cognitive ability. I feel really fortunate that I have the cognitive parts of my brain have been spared by this illness at this point. There's nothing that it's a really interesting living with a progressive illness and a progressive disability is, it is a very challenging, and I would not call any of this boring or old hat anymore. Like I'm totally in it all the time.
Yeah. And so then, like, how did you end up becoming a dietitian? So what was the interest there?
So truthfully, so I was diagnosed with MS when I was 15. My baby sister, who is not a baby anymore, but Katie was 13 when I got my diagnosis. And I think for the first year of my family knowing that I had this chronic illness, my mom and dad were really, really focused on me. And in the context of the first few years of my living with multiple sclerosis, my family, as I said briefly, like we were associated with an organization in the Boston area that was trying to, fundraise and research MS. And my aunt works in I don't even know what to call it, the industry of like making independent films. And so we created a documentary called Finding Our Way, and it featured me and 5 other young people with MS. And my mother was interviewed at one point in the documentary saying something about Katie, mentioning to my mom, "What do I need to do, Mom, for you to see me right now? Do I need to start doing intravenous drugs? Do I need to be have unprotected sex? I am still here." And all of these things I'm piecing together, in retrospect, of course.
Yeah.
But by the time, so I was 17, I was a senior in high school, 17, maybe 18. I needed to return something to the mall, and I was taking my sister with me. Her journal was open on her bed, and it said, "Well, I guess I have an eating disorder." I proceeded to put my sister in the car, not put her there, but she got into the car willingly. And I yelled at her for 20 minutes. "What are you doing, Katie? You're so brilliant. You're so beautiful. Everybody loves you. You're so good at sports. Like, why would you do these things?" Having no understanding of, one, what it meant to have an eating disorder, because I am very privileged to have never experienced a dysregulated relationship with really food or body. And so it was very new to me. And I berated my sister for a really long time, and we got into the mall and Katie ran away from me. And at that point, my original dream, I was going off to college. I wanted to be a sports broadcast journalist, but then I lost the ability to wear high heels, and I had been started on new medications. I was not feeling well when I was away at school. I ended up transferring colleges to come back to be able to temporarily live at my parents' house. And when I returned after having been gone to college for about a month, I came home to a sister that I didn't recognize physically or emotionally at all. And I decided then that I wanted to be, I took my first nutrition class, and I said, "Oh, I love this, and I want to be an eating disorder dietitian." And I graduated from college in 2.5 years. And I mean, I'm so grateful that I did what I did, but the whole time saying, I want to do this before I can't do this.
Yeah.
all the while, like never knowing, of course, never really knowing that there would be a time that I would have a physical limitation. But I knew immediately that I wanted to be an eating disorder dietitian, to tell my sister that people get better. And she has, and so many of my clients have too.
Wow. And with that, I mean, you talked about finding her journal and then berating her in the car. Was the berating about, I've got MS and this isn't a choice, but what you're doing is a choice? And obviously that's not actually the case, but at that point, is that how it felt to you?
I don't believe that I brought any of my story into it. I think it was from where I sit, and if my recollection serves, because again, at that point, Chris, my MS was present, but it was like, it really didn't affect my day-to-day anything.
Yeah.
I was just worried about Katie, but I also had what I understand now to be just an uneducated understanding of what eating disorders are. And to be frank, this is a place that I think a lot of people feel quite a lot of shame around not knowing exactly how to support their loved one. And if we are privileged enough to not have personal experience with an eating disorder, it makes sense that we don't know. It makes sense that we might feel angry or frustrated or want the people that we love to just get better. And I was young, but I didn't want my sister to suffer.
Yeah, totally. And as you're going through the dietetics training, I mean, at no point have we kind of talked about your upbringing in terms of food. So yeah, like how present was that? How much of a focus was going on in your childhood and in your adolescence with food?
So I've lived a privileged life, and that food has never been a thing that I've really thought very much about, to be quite frank with you. Like, there's always been enough food, and I'm not a particularly picky eater. My family, I was certainly raised in, again, South Dakota as context. I definitely had a more kind of crunchy granola house than most of my friends.
Yeah.
But you know, food was never really spoken about in a way that was dogmatic or, you know, good or bad. But I remember my mom taking me to like a natural food store and getting me a honey stick as a treat, which is like a tasty treat, but also a kind of a bizarre sweet to give to a young person. And, you know, when I was first diagnosed with MS, my first neurologist, who then went on to become a research neurologist, which I think was a better fit, said, you know, Anna, stop eating saturated fat. And very briefly, I went through a phase of, you know, trying to be really, 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 really adherent to that rule. I lost a little bit of weight as an adolescent, which is never a thing that is indicative of anything good. And then I got bored of eating what was then, and probably now is a lot better, but not particularly tasty foods. And then I just got bored and went back to eating the way that I eat.
Yeah. And so with all that, then when you did go off to study, how was it then learning about food? Because I mean, my assumption from knowing what you do now is that a lot of what you then were taught you now disagree with. And so how was it kind of learning that paradigm about food?
So, you know, this is a funny thing, because I think back to my dietetic education, and the only time, and this is brief, but the only time, actually there's a second time, but the only time really in my life where I have been disconnected from food or from my body, the only time that I have been preoccupied by food was in classes where I was meant to track what I was eating and calculate things based on, you know, the dietary equivalencies of whatever it was that I was consuming. And I I lied on 24-hour recalls, thinking the people around me were going to be judging me. Like, holy moly. And everything that I was taught was from such a weight-centric paradigm.
Yeah.
I didn't really learn anything about feeding oneself for health promotion, although my master's degree is in health promotion. The way that I was conventionally trained, health promotion really was about weight loss. Yeah. And like, how do we help our clients live in the smallest bodies possible? Which I think is changing. General education around that, I think, is shifting, and not quickly enough.
Yeah. But is it also shifting then more to more the sort of orthorexic type way of viewing food, where it's not, okay, we might not be saying that everyone has to lose weight the way that we were, but we're now talking about how healthy it is to eat blueberries or whatever it may be, and kind of very much to see it through that lens.
Yep. So again, it's been such a time since I've been out of school. I don't know how people are being now trained. And, the scary thing to me, when I really think about it, Chris, everyone walks around with a computer in their pocket now.
Yeah.
And so the ubiquity of nutrition, I'm going to put quotes around the word information or wisdom, that's available on the internet. And it is all about, the myriad of ways that you can enhance your life and your diet and your lifestyle by means of what is exclusively privilege, and putting on a pedestal one particular way of eating, which is kind of like Instagram worthy food, right? Like these like bright colors. And yes, I think a lot of what we are contending with now is more about what pop culture is ascribing as health promoting, as compared to what human bodies are actually seeking.
Yeah. And you talked about there was some point, I think, in your teenage years where you weren't eating saturated fat, and there was some idea of, I'm trying to eat in a certain way to help with the MS. So did that then reappear at any point during your dietetic studies, because there was some new information, or there was some new way that you were thinking about things because of what you're being taught? You're like, oh, maybe I can change some of this by eating X, Y, and Z, or cutting out X, Y, and Z.
So again, when I was in college, I wasn't thinking so much about MS because I lived in a physically able body. Yeah. My brain was still functioning the way that I needed it to academically, and I was not particularly disabled. I will say, my mom, both of my parents are biology majors. Neither of them do anything with biology now, but my mom was very interested in, healing me with nutrition. Yeah. And I can't count the number of dollars that have been spent going into talking to naturopaths, talking to Ayurvedic specialists, talking to acupuncturists and healers of all different ilks. My mom bought me a juicer when I turned 20. And there was this whole idea about, giving your digestive system rest when you are in the midst of a flare. I never really did any of those things. And again, because of the way that I was raised, and again, privilege, I happen to eat by choice a lot of the ways that I guess what is now kind of accepted as general, food wisdom a lot of things that I consume are already in line with what pop culture elevates. And if I can fast forward a little bit, about 5 years ago, maybe now at this point, I became aware that and I'm sorry that I'm fast forwarding well past college, but about 5 years ago, my disease was progressing in a way that I really felt uncomfortable. And I wanted to do something because I thought that there was a thing that I could do. And this book was published, and a doctor wrote about how she healed herself of progressive MS, which is not a real thing, but I was really excited, and I dug into her book, and I dug into all of the research around anti-inflammatory eating. And I, for the first time in my life, minus that short time in high school, followed someone else's food rules and ate in a way that was entirely against my values as a human, and led me to eat in a way that was counter to everything intuitive to me. And at the end of it all, wouldn't you know, I still had MS.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, part of me asking some of these questions as well is, so my wife has rheumatoid arthritis, and it was diagnosed 2.5 years ago. So it occurred through her becoming pregnant, and a couple of months after our son Ramsey was born, she was not in a good way at all. Could barely walk, could barely pick him up, was in constant pain. And there were other things that were going on at the time as well with her health. But we had a really, really shitty time of it for quite a while. And she was just doing a ton of research and was trying to figure out, okay, how do I change this through all various different means. And tried lots of things from a food-based perspective. I mean, probably in a similar vein to you did, in terms of all the anti-inflammatory type stuff. And we're kind of 2.5 years on, and I can say that categorically nothing changed from her dabbling in all this food stuff. And it was really, and probably in the same way for you, we both, myself and her, are both really good intuitive eaters. We have really amazing relationships with food, where food just feels so easy. We enjoy food, but it's just food. And to go down that road where you're really starting to tinker with things and go against your own intuition and to kind of be eating in this way, it just felt so disconnected.
Mm-hmm. And the horrible thing about this experience for me and for so many others, and it sounds like your wife as well, and maybe not your wife, but there was this sense of such extraordinary disappointment. So this worked for Terry Walls. Yeah. Why isn't it working for me? Did I not do this well enough? And so I am, it's the second sword. I already have this chronic illness, and then I'm not eating. I'm following all of these wackadoo rules, and I'm not getting better. And shoot, I should be doing differently. I should be doing more. And I've had conversations with other people who are saying, even if I wanted to, I can't afford to eat in this way that might heal me. I have so much, I don't wish ill will on anyone, but I think that it is very unfair when people talk about healing autoimmune conditions with food. Of course, if someone is allergic to a thing, don't eat that thing. But outside of a straight allergy, I think that we can do such a more gentle and effective job in helping people take care of themselves that is not about following some random person's recommendations.
Yeah, totally. I mean, and for from my perspective on her and her healing and where she's at, like reducing stress has been the thing that has made the biggest difference for her.
Yep.
And we are very lucky to be able to have done certain things that has made that doable. But that for me, at least hands down, has the biggest impact, bar none.
Yep.
And how was it for you during that experience then? Because you're working with eating disorder clients, you're kind of promoting intuitive eating, and so was there this, I don't know if it's cognitive dissonance, but was there this weird feeling of this doesn't feel like what I'm normally about?
So before I actually made the decision to go on this protocol, and at the time I was working in a residential eating disorder facility, and one of the things that I really love doing is eating with my clients. In the time of pandemic, I can't really do that, but I love being a good food role model. I love being able to share my normal, relationship with food. Not to suggest that everyone is going to be as excited or exuberant about food as I am. That's not the end goal. But I know that my being able to be normal with food has been really helpful and healing for some people. So before I did any of this, I happened to be a part of a clinical supervision group that I've been a part of for the last almost 10 years with some of the most lovely dietitians in the Boston area. And I actually took it to them before I made any decisions because it felt so out of order with the way that I am on the planet. And I said, like, ladies, can you help me with this? Because I want to do this thing, but I also acknowledge that it's going to undo a lot of things, or it's going to mean that I'm living in these kind of dual places where I'm not talking to my clients about the things that I'm eating, and I'm not necessarily sharing the same foods that we once did. Can I still be an effective dietitian? And of course, they all said, we understand you have to do this thing. If it can help you feel better, like, God bless. But it's like, what an interesting thing to have, like the awareness of the fact that following this protocol was going to take me so far away from the way that I now eat and the way that I encourage my clients to eat. Like, I knew that it wasn't, I knew that cognitively it really wasn't right for me, but I felt like I had to do something.
Yeah. I totally get that. And I mean, when Ali did this, I said, like, supportively, I was like, look, if you're going to do this, I will do it with you, because I can't be just eating all the regular things that I eat and then you're watching me and you're feeling miserable. So I was like, oh, I will do this with you. And about 2 weeks in, she's like, you need to stop. She's like, you are not a nice person when you're eating in this way. Like, this is not helping me one bit. Like, go back to what you usually do. And so, yeah. And then thankfully she got off doing that as well. And we've kind of gone back to how it always was.
Yeah.
And so when you were starting, like, at what point did you discover intuitive eating?
So I will tell you, I'm very fortunate to be in the Boston area that is such a health at every size, rich place. I read intuitive eating, and this is when I could still sit in the backyard. I irresponsibly was sitting in the backyard in a bathing suit, tanning, and reading the book. And I read it, I think I read like the second edition about a decade ago. And at the time I was working on an inpatient unit, and obviously not there is not a place where I can apply principles of intuitive eating, or I couldn't with my clients. But it felt really wonderful to have this book that was, it kind of underscored all of the things that I've ever done with food. And as a person with thin privilege, I haven't had to contend with, diet culture bullying me. except for that one time that I tried to heal myself of MS. But I don't even remember how many years ago I decided to become an intuitive eating counselor. It just felt like the next right step in my career, because it really underscores so much of the work that I do, because I exclusively work with folks with eating disorders. And in the 10 years that I was working at higher levels of care, when I was asking people, what is your long-term treatment goal or nutrition goal, almost everyone said, I want to be an intuitive eater. Not necessarily understanding all of the idiosyncrasies that phrase encompass, but like that should be a gold standard. That should be where we are looking to get our clients back to. And so I think it was the combination of this really health at every size rich community. And I can't tell you specifically, Chris, what made me decide that was, the next right step, but to be a health at every size practitioner meant that I needed to, and actually to be an eating disorder practitioner meant that I needed to throw away most everything that I was conventionally taught about food and nutrition and, go back to the drawing board. And intuitive eating is a beautiful drawing board to start from.
And when you learned about it, were you then trying to bring it up with the places that you were working at? And if so, what was the reception like when you did?
So, yes. And I think it would be very different now if I were still working in a facility. But I think when people started talking about intuitive eating as kind of a common vernacular, and it's still to this day, there's this very big misunderstanding that intuitive eating is, eat when you're hungry, stop when you're full, and that's it. I think that it was hard. And I have been I've been very privileged to work in facilities where I have been promoted and I have been heard. Even as a young person, I have been, directors of departments and held national titles. And I think in some ways, because of my relative youth as compared to my peers, things weren't necessarily heard or able to be kind of held in the same way that they might be now. And also I am just like a lot more assertive at this stage in my life than I was when I was, a younger version of myself. But if I could go back, I would pull in many more components of intuitive eating a lot earlier in the treatment process. I think there is a belief that, intuitive eating is only for people when they're all the way recovered from their eating disorders, where in fact, different principles of intuitive eating are applicable from day one.
Yeah, totally. And even the ones that aren't so applicable in terms of hunger and fullness, if you can say, okay, cool, at this stage, they might not be reliable as feedback, but let's start to notice them and see what you do notice. And yeah, I like, it's not that you have to depend on them, but by all means start to appreciate them and see how hunger appears for you in your body and what happens when you go longer without having a meal, like even, not necessarily intentionally, but just be aware.
Yep. Just notice.
Yeah.
What does this feel like?
Yeah. And so at the moment, are you working just solely in outpatient now, or what makes up your work now?
Yes. So I am so privileged to have a full private practice. And I work exclusively with folks healing from diet culture, eating disorders. All of my clients have eating disorders, but I think of, eating disorder recovery is not a thing that's happening in a bubble. So I am very privileged to have my private practice. And I'm also very privileged to work in a place where I'm being reimbursed for or by insurance for virtual sessions, given the state of the world right now.
Yeah.
I'm very, very fortunate in that regard.
And did you get to a place where you just realized, okay, I don't enjoy the residential side of things? Like how did you end up in the outpatient place? Or were you thinking about running your own facility or
So I've had a private practice since basically the beginning of my time as a dietitian. My husband's best friend is a dietitian, and she had just had her first child. And when I became an RD and I joined her outpatient practice, I was only seeing a handful of eating disorder clients at the time. But as long as basically since the very beginning of my career, I've had an outpatient practice. I've always wanted to have my foot in another clinical realm. And I actually really loved, I think in some ways, the most rewarding. And I say that because in a residential facility, you get to see these relatively monumental shifts from the day of admission to the day of discharge. If someone gets to stay for a long enough period of time, there's really beautiful work that happens. And you get to witness, I was able to witness the whole thing. I would never have left my job as a residential dietitian had I not acquired a disability that made it impossible for me to get into the house. And when I left my post as a residential dietitian, I was promoted to hold a national position holding or supporting other eating disorder dietitians within the organization that I was working for. And none of the sites were actually accessible. And so it became very clear that truly, if I was going to affect change, I needed to be able to work on the ground with the people that I was supporting, and I was not in a position to do that. And so I took myself out of that ring. And I mean, the clients that I had in my private practice are in some ways right now still the same people that I had several years ago when I left working in that residential facility. Some are obviously different, but I'm very lucky that I stopped being able to do, really one part of very rewarding work, and am lucky that I think about this often, Chris. I feel very lucky that I was not in a disabled body at the start of my career, because if I were, I don't think there's any possibility that I would have been given the opportunities that I have had.
Yeah.
And now that I am here, I feel very grateful for all of the opportunities that I have been given. And I am happy to be able to serve a smaller population in my private practice and a much larger population on the internet, which is wild.
Yeah. And is that experience of doors metaphorically being closed to you because there wasn't access, was that what then led to you starting to talk about your disability? Because I know prior to that, you hadn't been sharing so much about it. And it was then, is that the thing that caused that shift?
So yes, very much. And I only started talking about my disability in 2017, and I was not, I mean, everything is funny in retrospect, but I was not that disabled then. But I was at a national conference, or I guess an international conference in Vegas, and I told people to look for me in a scooter. And I can't tell you the number of people who looked over me or talked about me as though I wasn't in the same space as them. Like I experienced becoming invisible for the first time in my life. And because of that experience, I made the decision to very assertively start talking about my experience as a disabled professional and, sharing the things that I'm learning, because as a person who has not been disabled for the entirety of my life, there are things that I am learning that had I not become disabled, I would have never known that when you don't look at a person who is in an other body, whatever the other means, that you render a person invisible, you're not being polite. I didn't know that until I actually had people not look at me. And so I feel, I certainly can't parse my identities out anymore. And it feels really important to speak to, the many reasons why people choose to follow me.
Yeah. And did it went after that conference, and then with the decision to speak up and address it, did that feel like a really big deal? Like, were you kind of really unsure of like how it would go?
So to be honest with you, I was so angry, Chris. I was so disappointed, because we are a community, particularly in Boston, and I would like to say as an eating disorder community, that is intended to be inclusive and is intended to be a little bit tuned in to the experience of, or at least curious about experiences that we don't necessarily have personal experience with.
Yeah.
And to have some of the most prestigious eating disorder practitioners in the United States do the things, like truly walk past me as though I was invisible. I was so hurt, and I went through, I had a grief phase, and then I was angry, and then I called Rebecca Scritchfield and I said, let's talk about this. And actually, I think Christy Harrison was the first podcast that I think I called Christy and asked if I could, talk with her about that experience. And I feel really fortunate that people are taking my words around this, and I believe are actually changing the way they interact with folks that live in different bodies.
Yeah. And in some senses now, like, does it make it easier for your clients to relate to you? Because, I don't know, it makes you more relatable. Like, they can visibly see that the thing that you're living with every day and that you can't do anything about it. And, I don't know, helping them feel like, okay, she must understand body image struggles or body acceptance.
Yep.
That earlier on, when they knew nothing about what was going on, there was all these other assumptions about, I don't know, how much of an easy ride you had.
Yes, I for certain. When I first became disabled, I remember, and this is very early on, but I had a cane, and I used to hide it behind my chair so that my clients wouldn't know, like with quotes around it, wouldn't know that I was in fact a disabled person. And now, if I were in my office, my big walker is the first thing that you see when you walk into a room, if that's what you choose to focus on. And the thing is, Chris, so I live with extraordinary privilege, of most every privilege that there is. And my thin privilege has, I believe, in some ways made it potentially challenging for some folks to, necessarily feel all the way comfortable in space with me. And I know for certain that my living in a disabled body does make it a little bit easier to be with me in space. And it makes, I am a much better clinician because of the experiences that I have, or that I have and have had. And I believe, modeling the ways that I take care of myself, modeling the ways that I am kind of unabashedly disabled, makes me more approachable.
Yeah. And what was your approach before, like, and I'm just thinking, like, I know in some circles they're very big on disclosure. I know, like, Carolyn Costin is very big on, if you've had an eating disorder, talk about that with the person that you're working with, and so kind of bring your lived experience into the room. And then there's obviously the other end of the spectrum where it's like, no, be kind of detached. It's just about the person who's sitting there. What you bring to the room or your backstory is not so relevant. So I'm just wanting to know, like, what was your kind of default with that, and has that changed?
So originally I was working in an inpatient facility, and I was actually discouraged from talking about my MS, which, as a young practitioner, not necessarily knowing how effectively I would have held the space for my clients to have a response to that, I don't know that that was wrong. And then working in a space where I was allowed to be disabled and allowed to talk about my body experiences, it changed the way that I worked on an inpatient residential. It changed the way that I interacted with my body. But I will say, I became disabled working in a residential facility, and I spoke very negatively about my body in front of my clients, really thinking that because I had MS and because I was disabled, that my experience was so far removed from anything that they would relate to that it wouldn't be damaging. And I think one of my favorite lessons, or a lesson that I am most grateful for, was actually hearing from my clients, Anna, like, it doesn't help us and it doesn't help you when you say all of these things about your stupid leg. It makes it more, it makes it just more challenging. And I had kind of given myself this pass because it was just like, well, you have MS and, like, you're disabled. They have a different body image experience than you do, but it's, it's okay. Be really unkind and talk negatively about yourself. And because I got feedback from one of my clients, I actually created a shit talk jar, and I had a jar in my car, and every time I said something negatively about my body, I put money in that jar. And then ultimately, every time I had, like, a negative thought about my body, I put money in that jar. This was a long-term neuroplasticity experiment. I ended up donating quite a lot of money to a local eating disorder treatment facility when I was finished with the use of that jar. But I changed the way that I spoke about my body in a way that I actually think is really quite practical and helpful, not just for folks with chronic illness or chronic disability. And so I feel very fortunate to have had compassionate clients who have given me education about how to be a better earth suit inhabitant.
Yeah. And what are other ways that you've kind of moved through the kind of the grief process? And again, this might not be something that ends. I think I heard in an interview you talking about, like, grief is a process that doesn't have an end point. But I guess the grieving, but also then the acceptance piece, because you wrote an article for Self Magazine, which I loved. And there was a quote you said, like, living in a body with changing abilities is rather extraordinary. It's a little bit like having the rug pulled out from under you when you least expect it, but over and over again. So given that is your experience, what are the things that you've done to get okay with that or be able to accept it?
Well, I will say, I think it depends on the day. And I say that offering myself quite a lot of grace and a lot of compassion there. I think we are sold a false bill of goods when people talk about, body positivity, and as though that is a final destination or a place that we all need to land. I actually kind of really dislike that as a landing place.
Yeah.
Particularly because body positivity wasn't made for, I mean, I suppose it was made for disabled folk, but it's not made for thin white women. That as a complete separate, as an aside, really good therapy and thoughtful conversations about grief being a process that is allowed to just persist, and allowing myself to feel really sad when I have less pleasant body days, and allowing myself to feel pleasantly surprised when I have days where it feels a little bit easier to be in my body. I actually didn't know that it was possible to be both in my body and very, invested in day-to-day functionality, just because life is very different and a bit more challenging in a disabled body, and a bit is not the right language. It's a lot more challenging. I also just have so much gratitude for the fact that I live with privilege, in that my disabled experience is much more pleasant than it is for folks who don't have the emotional support that I do, and folks that don't have the resources that I do. And it actually makes me very sad and frustrated. I feel very privileged, but I also feel anger and a little heartbroken that things are made more simple for some and not all. That feels very, very unfair. And so I grieve, and I give myself space to grieve. And I also take time to celebrate when things are worthy of, baby celebration.
Yeah, definitely. How do you think about acceptance? Like, how would you define acceptance if someone's listening to this? I've heard this term, I get this is kind of a concept, and I get what you're saying, but I don't really understand it or know how to get on board. And how would you define it?
Perfect. May I tell you another story?
Sure.
Perfect. Okay. I am a very clever human. And I think that I am pretty logical and pragmatic. And when I'm trying to think of the years don't actually really matter here, but I think backstory, in high school, I really loved high heels. And I think I wore high heels like most every single day from my sophomore year to my senior year. I wore heels in college and in grad school. And then I lost my ability to wear high heels probably during my dietetic internship. And I had put high heels on this list and said, if I want to be respected as a professional, if I want my peers who are quite a lot older than me to, give me any space and time, I need to be wearing high heels. If I want to look, attractive as a female, I ought to be wearing high heels. And so I had this really lovely collection of shoes. And for the sake of conversation, I'm just going to say, so 2012, I probably stopped being able to walk long distances in high heels. And so what would happen, my husband would drive, we'd go to a restaurant, and I would walk from the car to the table and then back to the car, and then I would take my shoes off. And then fast forward to a place where I'm only wearing high heels when I'm in my office, or only wearing high heels when I'm in my house. And then I stopped being able to wear them altogether, but I didn't stop buying them. So I would go into the shoe department and see this, these lovely shoes, and oh my goodness, I really want to put this on. And sometimes I would take a few steps in the shoe department. Sometimes I would just put a shoe on my foot, look at my foot and say, this is so pretty, I would really like to have it. So 2012, I stopped being able to wear high heels. I don't think I stopped buying them until probably the middle of 2013. And I didn't get rid of my shoes until probably the middle of 2014. This is just based on all of the shoulds that I had built up around high heels. Again, I'm a very sane person, but that is not, those are not a series of sane choices, like either monetarily or emotionally. I was creating this should dynamic. You should be a person who wears high heels because blah, 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 blah. And so the way that I liken body acceptance now, like I don't have to like the reason that I'm sitting in my chair and not floating. Like I don't have to like the concept of gravity, right? I might want to float right now. Yeah. But alas, we are on the planet Earth where there is gravity and we sit and we don't float. Similarly, you don't have to love a body. I think that body love is a prerequisite for nothing. And if we are able to practice acceptance of the here and now, what is this body moment that I'm having right now, we don't have to love it. But if we are present with the kind of the mindfulness in the moment, we can be generous with ourselves. We don't have to buy shoes that don't fit. I mean, that's obviously a massive metaphor, but like buying shoes that don't fit us, are not in service to our best selves. Acceptance does not have to be a thing that you enjoy, but there's nothing protective. When I was leading my conversations, I would walk into a room and say, "Oh, my stupid leg," or "Oh, I can't believe I'm wearing flats," or whatever ridiculous thing that I would say. All I was doing was making myself feel badly and making the people around me uncomfortable, trying to fill in the next gap. And so to me, body acceptance is not about saying, I love and revere every part of this, earth suit experience. Of course not. But it is about being present with the what is in this moment, because there's nothing about this moment that is going to improve or in a lot of ways, I would say change at all, but certainly not improve by being unkind.
Yeah. Yeah. And I agree with that in its entirety. I mean, it is not to say you can't say, if I had a magic wand, I would change all of these different things.
Sure.
But it's the reality of like, I don't have a magic wand. And me thinking in this way, it's just creating an unenjoyable experience. And it's not that then the world outside isn't hostile or the world outside isn't causing issues based on your level of ability or your level of your weight or your looks, or for lots of different reasons. There are definitely outside forces that can make life more difficult because of that. But you then have like the double whammy of like you're doing that on the inside as well. Mm-hmm. And so it's not just in those experiences from outside, it's you're creating that on a day-to-day basis. Right. And so it means that, your life is not as enjoyable as it could be if there was that level of acceptance of like, okay, I don't necessarily like this, but I'm not going to constantly beat myself up about it.
Yeah. And I think the constant, berating of self, oftentimes I think people do it to make other people feel more comfortable. I would enter spaces kind of apologizing for myself before I even got there. And it didn't change my body. Like I still had MS. I still had a disability. It just made me feel worse. And so we don't have to do that to ourselves.
Yeah. I think the difference maybe for other people, whereas with you with MS, that's more of a permanent stay. Whereas for other people, there's a feeling of, okay, this doesn't have to be a permanent stay. And I'm going to almost like berate myself into changing my body somehow. And so, especially if you're then verbalizing that, it can almost be like, I know that I'm unacceptable, but I'm telling you that I'm going to be changing this. So I'm going to make myself be acceptable, and kind of like beating someone to the punch on that.
Yep. And I mean, this is all about self-protection. And that actually, I think, is the part of wellness culture that I hate the most.
Yeah.
The falsehood around the ease in which folks have the ability to, augment or make malleable their bodies. Bodies are really, really, really prefer homeostasis. And when we, by virtue of being uncomfortable in someone's body, or by virtue of a recommendation from a doctor, or by virtue of a teasing from a parent or a friend or a loved one, make choices to attempt to make it easier to live in one's body. One, of course, that's what you're going to do. Like that makes so much sense.
Yeah.
And I wish dieting really came with the fine print of like, this is going to mess with your mind really, really significantly. And for most humans, isn't going to be effective. And it's not because you're not good at it. It's because your body wants you to like persist.
Yeah, totally. And I think that is where people get to eventually. It's just you're wanting to kind of speed up that process and be like, okay, yeah, like this is the truth, that this is unlikely that it's going to be successful. And even, I would say, even the times when it is quote unquote successful, it's not successful in the way that people think it's going to be.
Right.
It's then I'm now having to keep up all of these behaviors and like this isn't particularly enjoyable. I mean, if I think back to what happened with Ali, like if that had actually really helped her, changing her eating that way, on the surface, like, great, this is healing it. But the next layer down to that is like, now I have to eat in a way like this that is very restrictive, that is unenjoyable, that is incredibly difficult for the rest of my life. And so you're then in this place of like, what is this trade-off? And is it really worth it as a trade-off?
Right.
So look, as I mentioned at the very start, you are doing amazing things on Instagram. So like when did you really start focusing on this?
So I'll say two things. I'm a creative person. I really love to make, art, and I love to write. But as I have my hands are a little bit different than they used to be. I take a lot of joy in creating, even making graphics for Instagram. I was looking back actually yesterday. I don't know why, but I started my Instagram account in 2013, and it's really only been, I suppose, since after IADEP, so a little bit after 2018, I started getting more active on Instagram. And now Instagram has taken on a totally different, there are so many different reasons that affirm my coming back. I have been so privileged to have created this inaccessible views experience on my page, because I mentioned, this is probably now like 2.5 years ago, I mentioned missing, being able to be in nature. And now we're in our 6th highlight, which means 600 plus photographs and videos of places that a person who doesn't have an able body, pictures and videos from all over the world are being, collected on my behalf. But it is so much more global than that. People who don't have, the economic flexibility to take long weekends off to go hiking, or in the midst of the pandemic, I just want to see some nature. It has just been such, it has been such a gift. And I feel really lucky, Chris, that social media has made it possible for me to speak about things that I think are like where my clinical and therapeutic expertise lies, but also has allowed me to kind of show up as a human in a way that I truly didn't know would be received as generously as it has been. I just feel so privileged.
Yeah, because you do. I mean, you've got this really lovely mix of sharing your own personal story and struggles and being very open about your disability and sort of raising awareness around that, as well as then really great content for someone who is in recovery from an eating disorder or even is on sort of the diet roller coaster and wanting to get off there, with just like really great positive messages around that. And also not just positive, but just real life. There was just, it's not all sunshines and rainbows, that there is just some kind of real good sort of reality as part of your posts.
I really appreciate that, because one of my goals, I am a very positive person, but one thing that I feel really proud about is my ability to navigate the English language. And sometimes that means that I'm saying things that are more assertive and more directive and more, like unpopular opinions. And that's okay. That's okay. I mean, we are up against what is going to soon be $100 billion, $200 billion industry. Yeah. That is, diet culture. And so like we have relatively small voices, but it's really important to me that the way that I show up is actually in a pretty assertive fashion. And I do that for a couple of different reasons. I do that, one, so if I'm speaking to someone who has an eating disorder, their eating disorder brains are really, really assertive. If I am kind of more lackadaisical and a little bit less, direct, I think the message gets a little cloudy, and I'm not really interested in being less than sharp and really clear in my messaging. And I also know, like my writing style is pretty pointed, and it's not going to be for everyone, but I feel I try to be as generous as I can be. And as I have somehow gotten quite a number of followers, I'm also pointing people towards social justice issues that are really meaningful to me, that have, in some ways, everything to do with what I do for a living. And I lose a lot of followers when I post things that are seemingly political, which is excellent. Like, that's okay. Yeah.
Do you get lots of posts from people who are up in arms and upset with you for posting that stuff, or they just leave?
They just leave. I mean, some of them comment and say, I'm really disappointed in you. And okay, I don't need to be for everyone, but I feel as though I have this following, and if I am not speaking to issues that are in one way or another pertinent to everyone, I think I am not doing humanity any good. And it's very much not, it is not my style to be silent about things that are really meaningful.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I have a huge amount of respect for what you do on social media. I've just never got my head around social media properly. And just and I think I have some limited beliefs around this in terms of my writing style. And I think you are very direct. You're quite punchy in terms of the way that you write up. And I I do 2-hour podcasts because I like kind of more rambly, more long form. Even with blog posts, my stuff is always quite long because, I'm not some wordsmith, but give me enough time and I can cover a topic. And I just, I've just not been able to really get into Instagram. And I think part of it is like, I can't do everything. And so I've decided, like, if I'm going to do a weekly podcast, this takes up many, many hours a week. And when I'm writing blogs, it takes up many hours. And so it's like, I can only do a finite number of things.
Right.
And if I want to do Instagram well, I don't have those hours in the day, or something else has to fall by the wayside. And so I've kind of slowly come to that place of just like, you know what, like you are not going to do well on Instagram, and that is completely okay.
And to be frank with you, when I first started my website a million years ago, I had this dream plan of, writing blog posts and thinking that was the more effective way to grab people. And fast forward, and my hands don't work quite the same way that they always have. Typing is not as easy as it once was. And so I dictate my Instagram posts mostly the night before I post them. And so I don't have a backlog of posts. I just, I say the things that I want to say and I post them. And I don't have to type anything. So it is a bit of a shortcut for me. But I'm very grateful.
Do you think that changes the way that the posts come out, or the way your writing comes out, because you're
Absolutely.
speaking it as opposed to typing it, and that does something different to the way that your brain forms sentences or uses words?
I think that if I were writing and I were writing long form, to be truthful, I actually appreciate being pretty direct in my messaging. I appreciate being clear and concise with regard to the language that I use. And I think my writing style has shifted, whether it's a long form something or more Instagram length. I think I have the ability to be a bit more, I don't think I struggle with verbosity, but have the ability to, perhaps be a little bit more gentle in my language choice if I'm writing something that is long form. But I actually prefer, for the moment anyway, the way that I am writing at this moment.
Yeah. Well, look, it's very effective, and you're doing a great job. So look, this has been wonderful. Where is there anything we haven't covered that you were hoping we were going to chat about today?
No, this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. I'm so delighted.
Okay. So the final question is just where should people go if they want to find out more information about you?
Please come find me on Instagram, because that is where I hang out. I am at Dietitian Anna, 2 T's, no C's. And I would be so, so happy to see you there. As another aside, when the pandemic started, I initiated what is now Virtual Connection. And so this is an hour of time every Monday that I donate. And I actually think I'm going to, even after, the vaccine is here, whenever that is, I think I'm going to continue to do it because I've been able to connect with people in a really lovely way. And I have a crew of other exceptional health at every size dietitians and therapists that are part of the Virtual Connection community during the week as well. So if you are looking for a little bit of additional pandemic support, please come hang out with me, 3:00 Eastern Standard Time on Mondays. Obviously, everything is saved to my page, but I would just love to see you on Instagram. Okay. And if you write me a letter or a message, a direct message, sorry, not a letter. I'm pretty good at responding. I don't have social media manager. It's just me, so it might not be quick, but I'll get to you.
Okay, perfect. Well, I will put that link in the show notes as well. And yeah, thank you so much for this. This was wonderful.
Thanks, Chris.
I hope you enjoyed the conversation with Anna Sweeney. She really is doing great work in the field of eating disorder recovery, and her Instagram is awesome. So please do check it out. So I have a couple of recommendations that I want to make. Ali and Ramsey were recently away. They went up to Scotland for a week without me. And so while they were away, I ended up watching quite a lot of TV and movies and documentaries. And it was nice to have some much needed rest and downtime alongside work. And in all of this viewing, there were two highlights that really stood out. So the first is a documentary called My Octopus Teacher. And I'd first heard about this when I was listening to a podcast with David Farrier. He was on Dax Shepard's Armchair Expert podcast. So David Farrier is a New Zealand journalist and also a documentarian. And if you've never watched the documentary Tickled, then you need to. It's possibly my favorite documentary of all time, just because it's so bizarre, and where it ends up is not what you're expecting when you start. And so David Farrier was the creator of that documentary. And so when I heard on the podcast that he recommended My Octopus Teacher, I took note of it. And then a couple of days after listening to that, one of my clients also recommended it and said that she thought it was wonderful and that I would like it. And I really did. It's the story of a South African guy who is also a documentary filmmaker, but he's having a midlife crisis, and he's just really burnt out and not sure what he wants to do. And so he starts swimming in the sea again, and he finds that it starts to help his mental health. And at some point while swimming in this new area of the sea, he discovers an octopus. And so he then goes back the next day and he sees it again, and he decides to just start going every day. And this then becomes a documentary. And it's about the relationship that he then develops with the octopus, which I know sounds very strange when I say it like that, but it really is this beautiful story. And it's shot magnificently well and just looks stunning. It's narrated and edited well. It's kind of one part David Attenborough-ish style documentary about the wonders of the sea and learning about all the different aspects of the octopus and the octopus life cycle. And probably there's lots of things in this documentary that have never been caught on film before. And so it's kind of half that, and then the other half is all these relationships. And so the relationship the guy has with the octopus, with his son, with his own life. And look, I don't want to oversell it and you feel let down, but yeah, I really enjoyed it. And part of that could be because it was this really sweet story and felt rather feel good. And this is in stark contrast to a lot of the stuff that I normally listen to or watch. But yeah, I was really impressed in how it was shot and how it was done. And so it's called My Octopus Teacher, and it is on Netflix. And then the second documentary is called Accidental Courtesy, and it's about Daryl Davis. So Davis is an American blues musician, and he's played with many of the greatest blues and rock and roll people to have ever lived. But he is also an activist. He's black, and since the 1980s has befriended many members of the KKK, and over 200 of them have now given up their robes and have left the Klan. And Daryl Davis is just this special human being. And the documentary shows him meeting with different Klansmen or different people in sort of hate groups, white supremacist groups, some who are still in these groups, some who have already left, and just shows a lot of the conversations he has with them. And why I like this so much was we're at a point where things are so polarized and where it feels like we are as divided as ever. And Davis shows that even at the most extreme ends of views, people can change. And he does this by talking to them and challenging the things that people say, but also finding common ground and finding common interests and finding common humanity. And being patient about this. So for many of the people who went on to leave the KKK, it took them many, many years. but he continues to speak to them during this time. He helps them if ever they need assistance. So he tells a story of one of the KKK leaders calling him up and saying that they've been unable to rent a van to be able to go to a rally. And Davis says, here, you can borrow my van. And you can just see that over time, the cognitive dissonance becomes sort of too much. So they're being treated so kindly by this black man. They're inviting him to their daughter's weddings. They're going on holiday with him. And at some point, they just see that the prior beliefs that they've had, just they can't keep them up anymore. And this is by no means like the only way that activism can work, and that this is the only way that society can get to a better place. Like, there's lots of different ways of doing this. But in a time when it feels like we're unable to talk to someone who votes differently from ourselves, or who has different beliefs about guns or abortions or whatever the highly charged issue is, it is rather incredible to see how powerful conversation can be. So it's called Accidental Courtesy. It's on Amazon Prime in the UK. And yeah, it's definitely worth a watch. And that is it for this week. I will be back next week with another show, and we'll catch you then. Have a good week, stay safe, and I'll see you soon.